The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. It came the way they all came, in the hands of a boy on a bicycle, a Western Union boy from Millstone Creek who had learned to keep his face still because of what his deliveries meant. He set it against the screen door, knocked twice, and was back on his bicycle before May Callaway reached the porch. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. The morning was May 1944, and the foothills east of Canaan Hollow were green the way only May makes them, that deep, almost painful green that follows a cold spring, the kind that makes the mountains look like they're trying to say something you aren't quite ready to hear. The dogwood blossoms had already fallen. The corn was 2 inches out of the ground. 12 white boxes sat in a row along the south-facing slope below the house, and from where May stood on the porch, she could hear them. A low, constant hum, steady, indifferent. The hives just worked. They always worked. She picked up the envelope. She did not open it. She carried it through the kitchen, past the table where 3 children had eaten breakfast an hour ago, past the cast-iron stove still holding its morning warmth, back through the narrow hallway to the room where she slept. She set it on the bed. Then she knelt, pulled the edge of the rag rug aside, and pressed her fingers along the 4th floorboard from the wall until she found the one that gave. The one her first husband, Robert, had told her years ago was loose and needed fixing. He had never gotten around to it. She lifted the board. There were 2 envelopes already there, both Western Union, both unopened. She did not look at them for long. She laid the new one alongside them, eased the board back down, and pressed her foot flat against it until it sat flush with the rest of the floor. Then she smoothed the rug back into place and stood up. She was 31 years old. She went back outside to tend the hives. There are things a woman can carry that have no name in the English language. Not grief exactly, because grief implies the weight might one day lift. Not strength either, because strength implies that the carrying was ever a choice. What May Callaway held in the spring of 1944 was something older than both of those words. The particular weight of a woman who had already lost more than the valley could count, and who got up every morning anyway, because the corn needed planting, and the children needed feeding, and the hives needed tending, and the world, indifferent as it was, did not stop turning to let her finish hurting. She worked 3 hours before she spoke to anyone. She pulled the bellows on the smoker, let the white oak chips catch and smolder, and walked the row of hives the way her father had taught her 20 years before. She lifted each lid with the flat iron hive tool she kept in her apron pocket, checked the frames one by one for capped brood and laying patterns, reading each colony the way a doctor reads a patient, looking for the particular order that told her the queens were working and the winter stores were being built. She did not wear gloves. She had not worn gloves in 2 years. The bees moved around her hands and crossed her wrists, and she let them, standing slow and still, because bees could tell fear from steadiness, and May Callaway was very, very steady. The valley had a name for what she was. They did not say it to her face. They said it in kitchens and over fence lines and in the low voices people use after Sunday service when they want God to know they are not gossiping, they are simply observing. They said it the way small communities say the things they half believe and half need to believe, because if it were true, if the name fit, then the terrible things that kept happening to May Callaway had a reason. And reasons were easier to live beside than accidents. Out at the road below her farm, 3 names were carved into a small wooden cross someone had planted in the ditch grass. Robert, Will, Earl. 3 names. 3 stones in the cemetery on the hill above the Baptist church, where the morning light hit the eastern faces first. 3 men who had loved May Callaway. 3 men who were gone. The valley watched her move between her hives that morning the way people watch something they cannot explain, with fear dressed up as concern, with verdict dressed up as sorrow. She did not look back at them. She had 3 unopened envelopes under a floorboard, and 12 hives in full spring bloom, and 3 children who needed her to still be standing when they woke up tomorrow. She worked until the light changed, and the question that had trailed her from every fence line and every church pew and every hushed kitchen in Canaan Hollow followed her still, drifting through the warm May air like smoke from the bellows. Impossible to outrun, impossible to answer. 3 men buried, 3 men who had loved her. Was she the reason? To understand what May Callaway was, you have to understand what she lost, and what she refused to give up even after. The world May Callaway was born into was not a gentle one, but it had its own kind of order. The Appalachian foothills of East Tennessee ran in long, parallel ridges from northeast to southwest, ridge and hollow, the way a hand pressed into soft earth leaves its mark. Canaan Hollow sat in one of those creases, a farming community of maybe 200 souls, strung out along a creek road, connected to the wider county by a single paved highway that flooded every April and dried by June. The families there had been on their land for 3 and 4 generations. They knew each other the way people know each other when there is nowhere else to go, completely and not always kindly. In the fall of 1941, the Hollow was still recovering from the Depression. It had not fully recovered. It would not fully recover for years. But there was a steadiness returning, a cautious one, the kind that grows back slowly after a long, hard winter, like grass along a fence line nobody expected to survive. Men were working, women were canning, children were back in school with shoes on their feet instead of rags wound with twine. Then December came, Pearl Harbor came, and the order that had been slowly stitching itself back together came apart again at every seam. By the spring of 1942, the Hollow's windows had begun to change. One Blue Star service flag appeared in the Hadley window, then another in the Morton place at the top of the ridge. A Blue Star flag meant a son or husband was serving. Every family that hung one knew what the other color meant, knew that if the telegram boy turned up the drive, the blue star would have to come down and the gold one would go up in its place. Gold meant gone. Gold meant you were now in a different category of American life, one nobody had asked to join. By the end of that year, there were 9 blue stars visible from the road that ran the length of Canaan Hollow. May Callaway was not yet among them, but she was watching. She had married Robert Callaway in the summer of 1938. The year she turned 25, and the year the creek flooded 3 weeks before the wedding, and everyone said it was a bad sign except Robert, who laughed and said the creek flooded every year, and that if bad omens came with the water, they would have all been doomed from birth. That was Robert. He laughed at things other people worried over. He was a broad-shouldered, plain-spoken man who farmed the land his father had left him, 40 acres of creek-bottom corn and a hillside pasture and a good stand of timber nobody had touched in 20 years. He was not a complicated man, but he was a reliable one. And reliability, May would tell Thomas Jr. years later, was the rarest and most valuable thing a person could offer. She said this the way a woman says something she had to lose before she fully understood it. They had Thomas Jr. in 1927. She had been 24 and Robert 26, and the boy had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and the kind of serious quiet that in a child either means wisdom or worry, and you don't find out which until they're older. When Robert's induction notice came in the spring of 1942, he was 34 years old. The Army was not yet taking men his age as a matter of routine, but Robert had gone to the enlistment office himself. May found out from the county clerk before Robert told her. That, too, was Robert. He did things and then explained them in that order. He shipped out in the fall of 1942, assigned to the infantry. His unit crossed into North Africa as part of the Allied campaign pushing into Tunisia from the west, the grinding, costly fight through Kasserine Pass and the Tunisian hills that would last until May of 1943. He wrote 4 letters from Tunisia. The last one arrived in late March 1943. It described the color of the North African dust. He said it was a different color from Tennessee dust, more orange, more ancient looking, like the ground itself was older there. He said he missed the smell of rain on red clay. He said to tell Thomas Jr. to fix the fence along the upper pasture before it let the cows into the timber. In April of 1943, the Western Union boy came up the drive for the first time. May read the telegram standing at the kitchen table. Then she folded it once and set it on the counter. She went to the back room and closed the door. She said nothing in front of the children. Only that night, when they slept, did she let herself break. By morning, she was in the field. The first gold star went up in the window of the Callaway farmhouse on a Wednesday. By Sunday, the whole hollow knew. William Danner had grown up at the far end of the hollow, on the Danner place that backed up against the ridge, a farm of similar size to the Callaway land, but less well kept, and Will himself was a similar sort. The land had made him, and he had made the land, and neither one had quite finished the job. He and May had known each other their whole lives, the way people in a small hollow know each other, by sight and by name, and by the occasional borrowed tool or exchanged seedlings at the beginning of planting season. He had passed through Harlan Valley the autumn before his induction, trading a mule for 2 hogs with a man named Fenter, who ran a farm at the valley's southern edge. That was the last journey Will Danner made before the war, and May would not know the detail until years later, when a stranger mentioned it in passing, and it lodged itself in her like something that had no logical reason to matter, and mattered anyway. Will came to her door in the winter of 1943, hat in hand, the way a man arrives when he has thought carefully about what he's going to say, and is no longer certain it was a good speech. He did not pretend the visit was about anything other than what it was. May had a farm she could not fully work alone, 3 children, including one boy nearly old enough to be drafted himself, and a hollow that had begun to go quiet around her in the particular way hollows go quiet around a woman living alone. Will had a farm he could merge with hers, strong hands, and enough stubbornness to survive the gossip. He told her this plainly. She appreciated the plainness. They married in March of 1943, a small ceremony at the Baptist church with the pastor and a handful of witnesses. May wore the same dress she had worn to Robert's burial, altered at the waist. There was no shame in this. The war had made a different arithmetic of things. Will moved into the farmhouse, fixed the upper pasture fence Robert had written about, and worked the land beside May with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood exactly what he had come to do. He was drafted 6 months after the wedding. He did not go to North Africa. His unit went to England, then to France. The 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, a National Guard division drawing men from Tennessee and the Carolinas. On a July morning in 1944, on a road south of Caen in Normandy, Will Danner's column came under artillery fire. The second telegram came in August. May lifted the floorboard for the second time. 2 envelopes now. She pressed the board back and went to tend the hives. The second gold star went up beside the first. Canaan Hollow stopped pretending it was coincidence. The third husband was the one the valley would never forgive her for, though there was nothing to forgive. Earl Bates was 51 years old, a widower himself, a quiet and competent man who had farmed the adjoining acreage for years and who was classified 4F by the draft board on account of a heart condition the Army doctors had identified in his physical and he had managed to ignore for the previous decade. He came to May late in 1944, not with a speech this time, but with an offer of labor. He would help with the farm through the winter, work the fields come spring, and in return, she would not have to watch 2 farms go fallow while the war lasted. This was a practical arrangement that became, over the months that followed, something more. The quiet, careful affection of 2 people who had both lost enough to understand the value of warmth in a cold house. They married in November of 1944. The hollow said what the hollow said. Earl worked through the winter of 1944 into the early weeks of 1945. On a February morning, in the lower field, he was trying to free a plow that had lodged itself against a buried stone. He was alone. May found him an hour later. Heart failure, the doctor said. Nothing unusual for a man his age with his condition. He had simply been trying to do one more thing, and his heart had simply run out of road. He was the 3rd cross in the ditch grass at the foot of the valley road. He was the one who never went to war. He was the one who made the hollow certain. Even the men who stay home die around her. May did not move. She had 3 children, Thomas Jr., now 17, and the 2 younger ones she had carried through all of it. She had 40 acres, 12 beehives, a cast-iron stove, and a reputation in Canaan Hollow that had curdled into something that made people step off the footpath when they saw her coming. She had a floorboard with 2 unopened envelopes and one that was already a year old and still sealed, because once she opened the 3rd, she would have to know all of it at once, and she was not ready for that. She also had, though she did not yet know what it would mean, 40 pounds of honey in her root cellar and 12 colonies heading into their most productive spring in years. 3 funerals. 3 times the valley had watched and whispered and waited for her to give way. May Callaway did something none of them expected. She stayed. Dolores Pickett arrived on a Wednesday morning in early April of 1943, before the second husband, before the third, when there was still only 1 gold star in the window and the valley's verdict was still forming itself into language. She came in a good dress and her husband's car, which meant the visit was official. She had thought about it, planned it, decided it was the Christian thing to do. May saw the car from the hive row. She watched it park. She watched Dolores step out and smooth her skirt and look at the farmhouse the way people look at a building they are not sure they want to enter. Then Dolores looked up the slope toward the hives and saw May watching her, and she lifted one hand in something between a wave and an apology. May set down the hive tool and came down the slope. She did not invite Dolores in. They stood on the porch. "What Dolores said," she said carefully, in the tone of a woman who had practiced the words and still wasn't satisfied with them. The church community wanted to help. There were families in the Hollow and in Millstone Creek who had room. Thomas Jr. was nearly old enough to be placed in a proper working household where a man could guide him. The two younger ones would need a mother's attention, and the churchwomen were prepared to assist in making arrangements. May could sell the property at a fair price. Howard Pickett had spoken to a man who would offer a decent figure and move into town where there was work for a woman her age, and the loneliness wouldn't be as hard. She did not say the word. She didn't have to. Every word she chose was arranged around it like furniture around a hole in the floor. May listened to all of it. When Dolores finished, May said, "My men are buried in that field. I'm not moving them again." The door closed. That evening, Thomas Jr. came in from the barn and found his mother at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pencil, adding figures. She had drawn a rough sketch of the south-facing slope, 4 squares for the existing hives, then 8 more squares added to the row in a line that extended past the old fence post down to the corner of the property. He asked her what she was drawing. She told him she was going to need lumber. He was 16 years old and had never known his mother to do anything without a reason, but he had also learned that the reason sometimes came later, after the thing was already done, and that asking prematurely was a waste of both their time. He went to bed. In the morning, she gave him a list and money from the coffee tin on the shelf above the stove, money she had been setting aside since Robert left, a little at a time, against the days she would need it for something she couldn't predict yet. "Lumber," she said again. 8 sets of frames and foundation, if Blevins has them. If he doesn't, bring back the lumber and I'll cut them myself. What May Callaway understood about honey in the spring of 1943 was this. The United States Office of Price Administration had been rationing sugar since May of the previous year. Every household in Canaan Hollow was operating on a war ration book. The second book, the one that covered sugar, had come out in the spring of 1942. And the allowance it granted was roughly a ½ pound of sugar per person per week. Enough for coffee, barely. Not enough for canning, not enough for baking in any real quantity. Not enough for the 100 small daily needs that sugar had filled in every American kitchen since before most people could remember. Honey was not on the ration list. The government had not rationed it because domestically produced honey was considered a home front contribution. The Department of Agriculture had been quietly circulating beekeeping guides to farms and households since 1942, encouraging production precisely because it would reduce the demand on the ration supply. May had one of those guides. Her father had sent it from Knoxville the previous fall, tucked inside a letter about the price of corn, as though it were an afterthought. It was not an afterthought. Her father had kept bees his entire life. He had taught May to work a hive the way most fathers teach their children the things they know will matter, practically, without ceremony, by simply doing it beside her until she could do it alone. She had inherited 4 of his hives when he moved to Knoxville to live with her sister. Those 4 hives had been producing steadily for 2 years. Good East Tennessee sourwood honey, pale gold and faintly spiced from the sourwood trees that bloomed in the upper hollows every July. Honey that had a taste like no other, and a shelf life, sealed properly, of longer than any of them would need. 12 hives could produce, in a good year, somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds of honey, 50 to 65 pounds per hive, which was what a well-tended Langstroth colony in the southern Appalachian foothills could reliably yield in a strong nectar season. May had done the arithmetic. She built the boxes herself over 3 evenings at the kitchen table after the children went to bed, working with a hand plane and a miter box, fitting the corners and painting the exteriors with the white exterior paint she had left over from the porch repair. 8 new boxes. She set them on their stands in the row below the existing 4, oriented south-facing for the morning light, 2 feet apart the way the guide specified. Then she drove to Millstone Creek and purchased 8 packages of Italian honeybees, the breed most common in the region, reliable, moderately gentle, suited to the Tennessee foothills, from the Hatcher farm, which had been supplying bees to the county since before the war. Thomas Jr. helped her carry them up the slope. She hived them in the early evening when the temperature was dropping and the bees were calm, releasing each queen carefully and checking that the workers were taking to the new frames. Thomas Jr. stood at a distance in long sleeves and a hat and watched his mother work without gloves in the settling dark, the bees orbiting her arms and hands in loose, unbothered spirals. "Doesn't it hurt?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, "but not as much as you'd think." She said it about the bees. He would not understand until years later that she had not only been talking about the bees. He found the box 2 weeks later. He hadn't been looking for anything. He was pulling an extra blanket from beneath the bed in her room. Winter was still holding on in the hills past what was reasonable, a cold, stubborn April that wouldn't release its grip, and his hand touched something wooden and solid where the blanket should have been. He pulled it out. It was a box made of dark walnut, about the size of a bread box, with a small brass hasp across the front. The hasp was threaded through with a padlock May had not owned before, or not that Thomas Jr. had seen. He turned it over in his hands. It was not heavy. It rattled faintly when tilted. He held it for a moment the way a person holds a thing they know they should not open, and they also know they could. Then he heard his mother on the porch steps. He slid the box back under the bed. He took the blanket and walked out of the room with his face arranged into something neutral. "There's an extra blanket in there," his mother said from the hallway without looking up. She was wiping her hands on her apron. "If you needed it, you only had to ask." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas Jr. said. He lay in bed that night and thought about the box. He had counted 3 times. He knew about 2 telegrams. He had seen the 2 gold stars in the window, but his father's death had been in April of 1943, and Will Danner's in August of 44, and Earl Bates had died in February of 45, and it was now April of 45. Less than 2 months past Earl's burial, and the padlock on that box was new, or new enough that the brass still had its sheen. 3 husbands, presumably 3 telegrams. Though Earl had not gone to war and had not come to her by telegram, he had come to her by way of May herself, finding him in the lower field. So what was in the box, and why was it locked? By the time the first sourwood bloomed in the hills above Canaan Hollow in the summer of 1943, May had 12 hives working at full strength. The older 4, established and thriving, led by queens in their second season. The 8 new colonies, slower to build but gaining, the new queens laying in steady, even patterns that May checked each week with the methodical attention of someone who had understood that the difference between a hive that failed and a hive that flourished was often nothing more than the willingness to look. The valley drove past her farm on the way to church and saw the 12 white boxes on the hillside and said what it said. That woman was always strange. May had 600 pounds of honey in her root cellar and 12 colonies heading into their most productive fall in years. By spring of 1943, May had 12 hives and no neighbors within speaking distance. She was, by every measurement the valley used, alone. What happened next, nobody predicted. The Hollow's decision to exclude May Callaway did not stop at her own door. Decisions like that rarely do. They spread the way cold does, through the cracks in things, into the spaces between people, until everything inside is the same temperature as the air outside, and nobody can say exactly when the warmth left. Thomas Jr. had been on the school's baseball team the previous 2 springs. He was a quiet, dependable shortstop, caught everything thrown at him, said little enough in the dugout that the other boys trusted him by default. In September of 1943, he showed up for the first practice of the fall season, and the coach, a man named Purdy who taught arithmetic and ran the team more out of obligation than love of the game, told him the roster was full this year. No room. He walked home alone. He was 16 years old. He did not tell his mother that evening, and she did not ask, because she had seen the way Purdy's wife moved to the far side of the road that same morning when May was coming back from the creek with a water pail. That particular sideways shuffle that people make when they want to avoid a thing without admitting they're avoiding it. May had seen it. She had counted what it meant. On Saturday, she walked him to town for supplies. They passed the Baptist church on the way back. His father's name was on the memorial plaque mounted to the right of the front doors. The Hollow had put it up the previous summer, a polished wooden board listing all the Canaan Hollow men who had gone to serve, the living and the gone, together, without distinction yet. Robert Callaway near the top, alphabetical order. Will Danner further down. May walked past both plaques without looking at them. Thomas Jr. looked. She found 2 of her hives knocked from their stands on a Monday morning in late October. Both bodies were on the ground, frames thrown loose, brood combs split open against the frost-hardened dirt. The stands had been moved deliberately, not storm-blown, not animal interference, but set aside with a particular kind of care that told her this had been done by a person who understood, at least vaguely, what they were doing. She stood in the cold morning air and looked at the wreckage for a long moment. Then she got the flat board from the barn and began the slow, careful work of coaxing the disoriented bees back. She could not save all the brood. The larvae in the broken comb were too young, too cold, already past recovery. What she could save was the queen. She found her on the underside of the second broken frame, alive, still moving, and she transferred her with the same steadiness she brought to everything, checking each frame before she set it down, building the colony back around its center the way you build anything damaged back, from the most essential thing outward. It took the better part of the morning. She never mentioned it. Not to Thomas Jr., not to the younger children, not to anyone in the valley. The following week, she drove to the Hatcher farm in Millstone Creek and bought 2 new bee packages, built 2 new boxes from the lumber still stacked along the barn wall, and set them in the row without ceremony. The row now held 14 hives where 12 had been. She was not going to let the valley shrink what she had built by so much as a single box. Elijah Thorne came to the fence line for the first time in November, on a morning when the sourwood honey was all sealed and the hives were wrapped in burlap against the early cold. He was a tall man, a generation older than May, with hands that looked like they had been doing serious work since before she was born, and a slow, deliberate way of moving that suggested he had long ago made a separate peace with time. He had farmed the 40 acres on the next ridge for decades, had traded occasionally with Robert in the years before the war, and had, as far as May knew, no particular reason to come to her fence now, except that he had decided to. He set a jar of dried pole beans on the fence post without saying anything first. She came out and looked at the jar, then at him. "In exchange for whatever you can spare," he said, nodding toward the hive row. "Wax if you have it, honey if you don't." She nodded. He looked out at the valley for a moment, the way a man looks at something familiar he is in no hurry to turn away from. "People fear what they can't explain away," he said. "Don't let them make their fear into your fault. That's how they transfer the weight. They put it on the person who isn't afraid to carry it, and then they call the carrying the cause." May looked at him for a moment. She was not accustomed to people saying things plainly without wanting something from the plainness. "I'll bring the wax," she said. He became the only person in Canaan Hollow who looked her in the eye without anything particular arranged on his face. No pity, no fear, none of the careful blankness people use when they are trying to conceal one of those two things. He called her the keeper once, in passing, meaning the bees, and she thought about the word for 3 days without resolving what she thought about it. By December of 1943, the nearest town with a reliable sugar supply was Millstone Creek, 7 miles by road. And even there the shelves ran thin by Wednesday and were not always restocked by the weekend. Every household in the Hollow was operating on a war ration book. The sugar allotment came to roughly a half-pound per person per week, enough for coffee, barely enough for anything else. Women were stretching it, substituting molasses where they could find it, going without in the places they couldn't. The small pleasures that had made hard winters bearable, the Sunday cake, the preserved fruit, the jar of sweet tea for company, were becoming memories. May Callaway had more than 600 pounds of honey sealed in crocks and jars in her root cellar. The first person came on a Tuesday evening in December, Mrs. Aldridge from the upper end of the Hollow, a woman who had not spoken directly to May in 2 years, who kept her eyes down during services and took the far path through town when May was on the near one. She came to the door with an empty jar and 2 folded dollars. May sold her a pound of honey. She said nothing. she did not watch her go. More came after that, one at a time, in the early mornings and the middle evenings when the road was quiet. They brought their own jars and their ration money, and they conducted the transaction at the porch step without coming inside, and they left without ceremony. May gave them fair weight and a fair price, less, honestly, than the shortage would have allowed her to charge, and she did not once look at them the way they did not look at her. That was the arrangement. It didn't need to be said. On Sunday, they still whispered in the kitchen about the cursed woman in the hollow. On Monday, they were back at her door with an empty jar. May knew. She watched them go, and she understood something she had not quite understood before. That what she was dealing with was not cruelty, not exactly, and not cowardice, not entirely, but the particular human capacity to hold two contradictory things at once and feel no contradiction at all. To buy a woman's honey in the dark and be afraid of her in the light. To need her and believe the worst of her in the same week. She had thought, for a while, that the valley's fear would lift once it ran out of reasons. She understood now that it didn't work that way. The fear made its own reasons. It would keep making them. Thomas Jr. found the box in January of 1944, moved now to the high shelf of the kitchen pantry, behind the second row of canning jars where the light didn't reach. He hadn't been looking for it. He was reaching for a jar of summer beans, and his fingers found the smooth corner of dark walnut where glass should have been. He didn't take it down. He stood in the pantry for a moment with his arms still raised and looked at it in the low light, at the brass hasp still bright, at the padlock hanging from it unchanged. He counted again the way he always counted. 2 telegrams accounted for, his father's and Will Danner's. Earl Bates had not died by telegram. But there were 3 men buried on that hill, and his mother moved this box every few months as if it were a thing that needed protecting. And whenever she passed the pantry shelf, she went still for a fraction of a second that was too small for anyone to notice who hadn't been watching her their whole life. He was 17 years old. He had been watching her his whole life. He closed the pantry without taking the jar of beans. She fed them, in secret, at night, jar by jar. And on Sunday they still called her cursed. That was when May Callaway understood. She wasn't fighting a drought or a war. She was fighting something older and harder. She was fighting what people do when they are afraid. She had understood the enemy. She had not yet understood what understanding it would cost her. The Selective Service Notice came in February of 1945, 11 days after Earl Bates died in the lower field, and 4 days before his burial, while May was still moving through the ordinary motions of the week with the mechanical steadiness of a woman who has decided not to stop moving, because the moment she stops, she will have to know the full weight of what she is carrying. Thomas Jr. brought it in from the mailbox. He stood in the kitchen doorway holding it and looking at his mother with the expression he had developed over the years, the one that held a thing without showing what the holding cost. He had learned that from her, though neither of them would have named it. She took it from his hand. She was familiar with government envelopes. She knew the weight of them, the particular way official paper inside official cardstock announced itself to the fingers before the eyes even read the return address. She stood at the kitchen table and felt the familiar hollow open in her chest. Not quite fear, not yet. Something earlier and colder than fear. The way a room feels before the temperature drops in winter, a second before you know the fire has gone out. Thomas Jr. had turned 18 in January. She had known this notice was coming the same way she had known every other hard thing, in advance, with enough time to think about it and not enough time to make it different. The Selective Service had been registering 18-year-olds since 1940, and the war was not done with its appetite. Not yet. She set the notice on the table. "Go finish the barn," she said. Her voice was steady. He went. She stood at the table alone in the February kitchen with the notice in front of her and her hands flat on the oilcloth, and she breathed, and she did not allow herself to think about North Africa or the road south of Caen, or the lower field where Earl had gone down pulling a plow, because if she started thinking about all the places a person could be standing when the world ended, she would never stop. She made coffee. She went back to work. The Sunday after, Dolores Pickett said what she said. May was not there to hear it. She had not been to church since Earl's burial. People had begun interpreting her absence the way they interpreted everything about her, as evidence. But Thomas Jr. heard it, because he was walking past the church on his way to the Hatcher farm to collect a coil of wire, and the cold March air carried voices the way it always does, further and clearer than the speakers intended. Dolores was standing on the church steps with 3 women from the women's circle in the pale winter sunlight, and her voice had the careful, studied sadness of someone who has practiced feeling sorry for a person they are also judging. "The Lord protects the righteous," she said. "There must be a reason he keeps taking from that woman." A pause, the sound of the creek at the bottom of the hollow, then another voice. "3 times now. 4 if you count the boy." Thomas Jr. walked faster. He did not stop walking until the Hatcher farm was behind him, and the ridge road was empty in both directions, and the cold air hurt his lungs, and he had gone far enough that the voices were only memory. He stood at the side of the road for a long minute, looking at the winter hills, at the gray hardwood ridges, and the dark lines of the fence rows, and the distant white dots of the Callaway hive boxes visible on the far slope, small as buttons. He did not go home until evening. When he came in, he set the wire coil on the floor and went to his room, and May looked at the wire and at the set of his shoulders as he passed, and understood, without a word being said, what kind of afternoon her son had lived through. She did not ask him about it. She did not ask because she already knew exactly the kind of thing that had been said, and because she knew that making him repeat it would require him to hold it in his mind again, and he had carried enough already. The collapse came on a Thursday, quietly, the way real collapses always do, not in the worst moments, but in the ordinary ones that come after, when the body finally registers what the mind has been refusing. May woke before first light in a way that had no name, not a sound, not a dream, just awareness, sudden and cold in the dark bedroom, and with it, a thought she had been keeping at a distance for years, which was, what if they are right? Not right about the curse. She was not a superstitious woman, never had been. She had her father's plain faith in the visible world, and she knew in the part of herself that knew things without argument, that 3 men dying in 5 years had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with a war and a damaged heart and the way the world removes people from the living without consultation. She knew this, but a different version of the thought was available to her, a practical one. What if the thing that had kept everyone at arm's length, the self-containment, the fortress she had built, the particular pride that let her go 6 weeks without asking a neighbor for anything, what if that wall had not been protecting her, but only isolating her? What if she had spent 7 years surviving in a way that was also a slow extinction, and the valley had been wrong about the reason, but not wrong about the result? She lay still in the dark and let that thought have room. She did not go to the hives. She went back into the house, and she latched the bedroom door, and she stayed there for 3 days. Thomas Jr. stood outside the door on the second morning and said her name once. She heard him. She said nothing. She heard him stand there for a long time, heard his breathing through the wood of the door, and then his footsteps moved back down the hallway, and she heard him go out to tend the hives. She could hear him from the bedroom window, the sound of the smoker bellows, the particular scrape of the hive tool against wood, and she thought, he's learned the whole thing. And then she thought, he learned it from watching me. And she lay back down with her arm across her eyes and did not know what to do with either of those facts, or whether they changed anything. On the third morning, she heard nothing from inside the house. She came to the window. Elijah Thorne was standing at the fence. He was not moving. He was not calling out. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his face turned toward the farmhouse, and there was nothing in his posture that demanded anything from her. No urgency, no performance of concern. He was simply present, the way a thing that has decided to wait simply waits. She dressed and went out. They stood on opposite sides of the fence in the cold morning, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the silence had the quality of silence between people who do not require it to be filled. Elijah looked out at the hive row where Thomas Jr. had tarped 2 of the boxes against the overnight frost. "Bees don't ask why winter came," he said at last, not looking at her. "They don't argue with it. They don't hold a meeting about whether the cold is fair or whether they deserved it. They just keep the hive warm, and they wait for spring." May watched the covered hives. "That's not ignorance," Elijah said. "That's not stupidity either. That is the wisest thing I know how to describe." He went home after that, the way he always went, without ceremony, back up the ridge road, his long coat moving against the bare brush. She watched him until the trees took him. She lit the smoker. She went to work. The induction date came in April. They had not talked about it again after the morning the notice arrived. Not directly, not with words, though it had been present in every room of the farmhouse for 2 months, sitting at the kitchen table with them, standing in the barn door, patient and immovable. The night before Thomas Jr. was to report to the processing station at Millstone Creek, May sat alone at the table after the younger children were in bed. Robert's watch was in front of her. She had taken it out of the drawer in the back room, the drawer where she kept his letters, the ones she had allowed herself to read. The watch was a Hamilton Railroad grade, plain and accurate, the kind built for men who needed the time and had no patience for decoration. Robert had worn it every day and left it behind when he shipped out, because he understood you didn't take irreplaceable things into places designed to take everything. She thought about the agricultural deferment. She had thought about it before, a farm with a single able-bodied male, the sole operator, could file. She knew how it was done. She had thought about it seriously, had almost gone to the county office twice, and had stopped both times for the same reason. Because deferring Thomas to keep him home was not protecting him from the war. It was protecting her from the prospect of losing him. And there was a difference between those two things that she was not willing to collapse. She was not going to hold him back out of her own fear and call it love. She was not going to do to him what the valley had done to her, make her grief into someone else's constraint. When Thomas Jr. came downstairs in the morning with his bag sitting at the bottom of the stairs and his face arranged into the Callaway version of composed, she was at the table with 2 cups of coffee already poured and the watch beside hers. She stood when he came in. She put one hand on the side of his face, her thumb against his jaw, and she held it there for a moment, the way you hold a thing you are memorizing. He was 20 years old in her hands, and also 6 and 7, and the morning Robert left, and every single morning after that. She picked up the watch and pressed it into his palm, closed his fingers around it. "You are not cursed," she said. "You are Callaway." He put the watch in the front pocket of his shirt over his heart. He picked up his bag. She walked him to the road, to the place where the driveway met the dirt track down to the highway, and she stood at the fence post and watched him go. The morning was cold and clear, the hills still bare, the hive row behind her beginning its low, familiar hum as the day warmed. She watched until the curve of the road took him, until she could not see him anymore. Then she turned around. She walked back to the hives, and she worked them, and that was what she did for the next several months. It was not heroism, it was the only motion available to her. The spring of 1945 passed the way springs pass when someone is managing rather than living. The world doing its ordinary work of warming and blooming and filling with bird sound, and the person inside it going through the correct motions without being fully present in any of them. May planted the corn. She tended the hives. She fed the younger children and kept the house, and wrote Thomas Jr. 1 letter per week to whatever address the Selective Service gave her. Careful letters that described the farm and the weather and the condition of the hive row and the names of the new queens, and never once said the thing she was actually thinking. There were 16 hives by summer. She had added 2 more in the early spring, partly because she had the frames and partly because the work of building them had given her hands something to do at the kitchen table in the evenings when the younger children were asleep and the house went very quiet. She received 3 letters from Thomas Jr. that summer. He was in basic training in Georgia, then in a staging camp somewhere he was not permitted to name. The letters were short and careful in the way that letters from young men trying to reassure their mothers are always short and careful, deliberately unrevealing, emphasizing the food and the weather and the friends he had made, saying as little as possible about anything that mattered. She read each one twice, set it in the drawer with Robert's letters, and wrote back the next morning. The war in Europe ended in May. The surrender was in the Pacific in August, VJ Day, August 15th, 1945. And Canaan Hollow received the news the way small communities receive the end of long grief, all at once, with bells. The church bell rang at noon and went on ringing, and May heard it from the hive row where she was doing the summer inspection, pulling frames in the heat and reading the laying patterns with the same methodical attention she had kept through everything. She set the frame down and listened to the bell. Then she picked the frame back up and kept working. That evening, she walked to the road. The hollow was out. The whole of it. Families she had not seen gathered since the last Christmas before the war. Men who had come home from the Pacific and the European theater. Women who had been waiting exactly as long as she had, but who had the particular relief of having gotten their people back. They were in the road, children running between the adults. Someone had brought a fiddle out onto the Hadley porch, and the sound of it came through the warm August evening, the way music sounds when it is answering something real. May stood at her fence. She had 2 gold stars and a fresh grave in the cemetery above the church. She had given more to the war effort than nearly anyone in that valley, in men, in grief, in years of carrying the whole weight of a farm and 3 children, and a reputation that had made everything harder than it needed to be. She had done it without complaint and without assistance and without asking anyone to notice. She was standing at her fence watching the celebration, and nobody was going to open the gate for her. She stood there until the light changed. Then she went back inside. January came, and the farm that had been too much for one person showed it. The 2 youngest children were a help now, old enough to do real work, feeding animals, carrying water, the 100 small tasks that add up across a day. But the main labor, the hive management, the field work, the roof that had developed a soft spot over the back bedroom, the pasture fence that needed 2 people to set properly, that still fell to May, and she was 32 years old and had not slept a full night in longer than she could accurately remember. And the particular cost of that was showing in ways she could see in the mirror on the rare occasions she thought to look. She lost 2 hives in January. A cold snap came down from the ridge on the 8th without warning, temperatures that the older valley residents said they had not seen in 30 years, and she found both colonies dead on the morning of the 9th, the bees clustered in tight balls around their queens, and the queens gone too, the cold having arrived faster than the hives could compensate. She stood in the frozen morning looking at them and felt, not grief exactly, but a very tired version of it. She had lost hives before. She had replaced them. She would replace these. She just needed a moment to stand there first. She replaced them 2 weeks later. Elijah Thorne died in February of 1946. She found out from a woman at the feed store in Millstone Creek who mentioned it the way people mention things they assume you already know, in passing, almost parenthetical, between 2 other pieces of news. Heart failure, the woman said. He had been found in his house, in his chair by the stove, probably the night before. He had no family in the hollow to speak of, or none that came. May drove home in silence. She understood that the valley would not let this pass without comment. She understood this before the comment came, the same way she had understood everything the valley would do before it did it, because by now she knew its patterns as well as she knew the laying patterns of her queens. She knew exactly which voice would say it, and roughly what shape the words would take, and how they would travel through the hollow in the particular, low, regretful key that the valley used when it was enjoying itself most. Even her friends, Dolores Pickett said, in a voice designed to carry and then designed to claim it hadn't been. May heard this third hand 2 days later. She was at the kitchen table when Thomas Jr.'s youngest sister told her, not fully understanding what she was reporting or why it might matter. The girl was 8 years old. She said the words and then went back to her supper. May put her fork down. She sat for a moment, then she picked it back up. Elijah Thorne had been the only person in Canaan Hollow who saw her without the valley's verdict already written across his face when he looked at her. He had called her the keeper. He had told her the wisest thing he knew, standing at a fence line in the cold. He was gone now, and she was, in a way she had not been since Robert shipped out in 1942, completely alone. It was a Sunday night in late February when she got the box out. She did not plan to. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in the low lamplight after the children were asleep, and she looked at the place where the rug met the floorboard, and she thought about the 3 envelopes under it, with a clarity she had been keeping at a distance for months. And she thought, I have been carrying the weight of these for 3 years without knowing what is in them, and the weight has not decreased in that time. And perhaps the knowing could not possibly be worse than the not knowing. She went to the kitchen and came back with a paring knife. She sat on the floor in front of the box, with the knife in one hand and the box in the other, and she held both things for a long time in the lamplight. The house was entirely quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the ridge timber the way it always moved in late February, high and fine and distant. The hives would be clustered tight tonight, waiting for warmth. She set the knife down. She slid the box back under the bed. She got up and turned out the lamp and lay down in the dark and did not open anything, and did not know what to do with herself, and eventually, near dawn, went to sleep. It was Dolores Pickett's grandson who came to the fence in the first week of March. He was 5 years old. a round-faced, unguarded boy who had not yet learned the particular valley skill of arranging his expression near certain people. He had escaped from his grandmother's yard by the simple method of walking through the gate she had left unlatched, and he had walked down the road alone in the early morning with the cheerful purposefulness of a child who does not yet know that walking somewhere alone is something he is not supposed to do. He stopped at May's fence and looked at the hive row on the hill with his head tilted to one side. May was on the porch. "Are those beehives?" he said. "They are," she said. He considered this. Then he looked at her with the frank appraisal of a child who has not been told yet what kind of look to give a person. "My grandma says your honey is the best thing she's ever tasted," he said, as though this were simply information that deserved to be in the world. Then he turned around and walked back down the road toward the picket property, hands in his coat pockets, perfectly satisfied with the exchange. May stood on the porch and watched him go. She stood there for a long time after he had disappeared around the bend. The morning was cold. The hives were beginning their slow, warming hum as the temperature crept up. Somewhere down the valley, the church bell struck 8. It was the smallest thing that had happened to her in years. One sentence from a 5-year-old. She knew that. She understood perfectly well that one sentence from a child did not change anything that the valley had built over 3 years of whispers. But something had shifted. Not in the valley. Not yet. In her. The war ended. The men came home to the valley. But for May Callaway, the question was never whether she had survived. It was whether anything she had survived for was still worth something. He came on a Thursday afternoon in November of 1945. May was on the porch with a basket of dried beans when she saw the figure on the road. She did not move. She had learned, over the past several years, a particular stillness in the face of things she was not yet certain of. A way of waiting that was not passive but watchful. The same quality she brought to the hives when she was reading A New Queen. She watched the figure walk up the valley road, and she watched the way he walked, and she recognized the way he walked before she recognized anything else about him. Robert's watch was in Thomas Jr.'s breast pocket. She would not know this until he opened his coat. He walked up the driveway without hurrying. When he reached the porch steps, he looked up at her and she looked down at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. He was 19 years old and thinner than he had been, and his face had something in it that had not been there before he left, something that had no clean name, but that she recognized from the mirror. The look of a person who has learned something they cannot unlearn about the distance between the world as it should be and the world as it is. She came down the steps. She put one hand on the side of his face. "See," she said. That was all. He put his arms around her. She let him. They stood in the driveway for a moment, and then she stepped back and looked at him again, all of him, the whole inventory, and whatever she found was satisfactory, because she turned and went inside and put water on for coffee, and he followed her in, and the 2 younger children came running from the back of the house, and the kitchen was full of voices for the first time in a very long time. By the spring of 1946, May had 20 hives working. The war was over, but the shortages were not entirely. Sugar rationing had stretched past the surrender, the supply chain still disrupted, the global production not yet returned to pre-war levels. In parts of the country, the ration books were not fully retired until late 1946. The families of Canaan Hollow were still stretching what they had. The families of Canaan Hollow were still stretching their ration books and still appearing at May's door with empty jars. Thomas Jr. worked the hives with her now. He had learned the craft through years of watching, and he moved through the boxes with a version of her own steadiness, not identical, less practiced, but present. May watched him work and said almost nothing. When he made an error with a frame, she did not correct him with words, but simply moved her hands to show him, and he understood and adjusted, and that was how they worked together. The honey went to the church social now. It went to the Millstone Creek schoolhouse for the end-of-year function. It went to the Aldridge family up the hollow, whose youngest boy had a persistent chest ailment that the old women swore was eased by raw honey mixed with water and lemon. And it went to the Bauer family at the Ridge Road Junction, who had 4 children and a husband back from the Pacific with 1 fewer leg than he had gone with, and a very long road back to anything resembling normal. May did not deliver any of it personally. Thomas Jr. carried the jars in a crate in the back of the truck, and if anyone asked, he said it was from the farm. May did not ask for acknowledgement. She had not asked for it in years. She had stopped expecting it sometime around the second winter without Thomas, and the stopping had been, she found, a relief. Once you stopped waiting for a thing, you could stop being disappointed by its absence. Dolores Pickett came on a Tuesday morning in the first week of April. She came alone, which was the only way this could have worked. She drove her husband's car and parked it at the foot of the driveway, which was also significant. She parked it at the road rather than driving up, so that if anyone she knew drove past, they would see only a car parked at the road and not a woman climbing the Callaway steps. May, watching from the kitchen window, understood all of this without having to analyze it. She understood the entire arithmetic of the visit before the door knocked. The knock came. May opened the door. Dolores Pickett stood on the porch step with a pound cake wrapped in a blue cloth. She was 61 years old and had lived in the Hollow her entire life and had, by May's estimate, spent a significant portion of the last 4 years supplying the valley with its opinion of May Callaway. She was not a wicked woman. May had known that for a long time, which was the more complicated thing to carry. She was a frightened woman who had found a way to manage her fear that had cost May a great deal. Dolores held the cake out. May looked at it. She looked at Dolores. She looked at the cake again. Then she stepped back from the door. Dolores came in. They sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the pound cake between them on its blue cloth, and they said almost nothing. Dolores said the cake was buttermilk from her grandmother's recipe. May said it looked fine. Dolores asked how the bees were doing this spring. May said, well, the cold hadn't held as long. There was a silence. There was another. They stayed for 40 minutes. Dolores left the cake when she went. She said goodbye at the door, and May said goodbye back, and that was the whole of it. No apology was offered. No speech was made. There was no scene, no accounting, no formal reckoning of any kind. That was the vindication, not the speech. The presence, the woman who had started the whispers, sitting in the kitchen of the woman she had whispered about, drinking coffee and leaving a pound cake on the table as the only language available to her. May ate a slice that evening with Thomas Jr. and the younger children. It was, she told them, very good. The following Sunday, Pastor Hale preached on sacrifice. He preached on the home front cost, the families who had kept things running, who had done the unseen work, who had paid the price of the war from inside the valley rather than from the front. He talked about what the war had asked of the women of Canaan Hollow and the children of Canaan Hollow and the men too old or too needed to go. Near the end of the sermon, he listed the Gold Star families of the Hollow by name. Margaret Callaway, he said, gave this valley 3 gold stars and never once asked us to match her faith. He did not apologize. He did not look at her directly. She was in the 3rd pew from the back, where she had sat every Sunday since she returned to church, choosing her distance carefully. His voice moved through the congregation and landed everywhere the way a voice in a church does, and every person in the room heard the name and the sentence attached to it, and there was a silence that lasted perhaps 3 full seconds before the sermon moved on. 3 seconds. That was the absolution. It was not much. It was not nothing. May sat still and let it land. He asked her about the box that evening. They had eaten supper, and the younger children were doing their schoolwork at the far end of the table, and Thomas Jr. was across from May with his coffee, and he asked the way adults ask things, quietly, without drama, from a place of having thought about it long enough to be sure he wanted the answer. Mama, the box. May looked at him for a moment. She pushed her chair back. She went to the back room. She came back with the box held in both hands the way you carry something that has weight beyond its size, and she set it on the kitchen table and sat back down. Thomas Jr. looked at it, then at her. I'll open it with you, he said. She set the box on the kitchen table. Thomas Jr. sat across from her. And for the first time in 4 years, May Callaway was not alone with what was inside it. She took the padlock key from the pocket of her apron, where she had kept it for 4 years on a length of string. The box opened. 3 envelopes, all Western Union, all bearing her name and the farm address in the clipped, impersonal typeface of telegrams that had been sent in bulk that season to addresses like hers all across the country. Thomas Jr. reached for the first one, Roberts, April 1943, and she let him take it. He opened it and read it in the lamplight and set it down carefully, face down, without speaking. He opened the second. He read it. He set it beside the first. Then he reached for the third and stopped. There was a fourth envelope in the box. It had been there, beneath the 3 telegrams, since sometime in the fall of 1943, when it had arrived, and May had put it into the box and locked the box and not opened either one since. It was a standard government envelope, heavier stock than the Western Union papers, with a return address from the War Department in Washington and a postmark of September 1943. It was not a telegram. Telegrams were thin. This was a letter. Thomas Jr. looked at his mother. She nodded. He opened it. It was from a captain named R.H. Morrow of the 34th Infantry Division, written in the particular formal personal tone of a man who has been asked to write a great many letters of this kind and has not yet found a way to make them feel like anything other than what they are, except this one went a step beyond the standard language of condolence. Captain Morrow wrote that Robert Callaway had been part of a rear-guard action in the Tunisian hills in the final weeks of the North Africa campaign, that his unit had been cut off, that Robert had volunteered to hold a position, a narrow pass in the rocky ground, to allow the remainder of his company, 18 men, to fall back to a defensible line. He had held it. The 18 men had reached the line. Robert Callaway had known what he was doing. He had made the calculation, Captain Morrow wrote, with perfect clarity, and had acted on it without hesitation, and there were 18 men alive who would not have been without him. Thomas Jr. set the letter on the table. He looked at his mother. May did not reach for it immediately. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the lamp flame for a long moment, and then she reached out and took the letter and read it herself, slowly, all the way through. Then she read it again. She set it down. She was quiet for a long time. He knew what he was doing, she said at last. He always did. She did not stand up and carry the letter to the church. She did not drive to the picket house. She did not fold it into an envelope and mail it to anyone, or hold it up in the road, or make of it any kind of answer to any of the years. She folded it once, the same way she had folded things her whole life, cleanly, precisely, with the care of a woman who understood that things worth keeping were worth keeping properly. She placed it back in the box alongside the 3 telegrams. She closed the lid. Thomas Jr. said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had grown up watching his mother carry things without explaining them, and he understood, finally and completely, that the explanation had never been the point. She went to the hives at dusk. The evening was early October, warm still in the way that October evenings in the Tennessee foothills are warm, the air holding the last of the day's heat close to the ground, while the sky above went pale and then deep, and the first stars appeared in the east over the ridge. The sourwood had long since bloomed and set, and the fall nectar flow was winding down, and the hives were in the last weeks of their active season, the colonies beginning the long, slow work of preparing for winter. May did not take the smoker. She had not needed it in years. She did not take her gloves. She walked to the south-facing row and stood among the hives in the settling evening, and the bees came to her the way they always came, without alarm, without hurry, moving around her hands and across the backs of her wrists in the unhurried way of things that have learned they have no reason to be afraid. She stood still and let them. She had learned that this was the whole of it in the end. Not a trick, not a technique, simply the willingness to be still in the middle of things that could hurt you, and trust that the stillness itself would become its own kind of answer. The valley lay below her in the October light, the hollow running its familiar length between the ridges, the church at one end and the Hatcher Road at the other, and the hollow's small lights beginning to come on in the early dark, one by one, the way they always had, and would long after she was done. The whispers were gone. Not because they had been proven wrong. They had been, in their way. But that was not what had ended them. They had ended because the valley had finally used them up. Gossip, like any fuel, burns out eventually, and what is left is just the ash, and the people who have to figure out how to live in the same place without the heat of it to keep them warm. May was still here. She had been here when the first gold star went up, and when the last man came home, and when the bells rang, and when the silence came after. She had kept 20 hives through 5 winters, and fed the hollow through its worst shortages, and buried 3 men with the same hands she now held open in the evening air, and she had not once asked the valley to admire any of it. The hives hummed. That sound, low, patient, constant, entirely indifferent to everything the world did beyond the hive boxes, was the sound she had listened to more than any other sound in the last 7 years. more than sermons and gossip and the creak of that particular floorboard. The bees did not know what she had survived. They did not care. They required of her only what they had always required: steadiness, attention, the willingness to keep showing up. She had never once failed to give them that. The valley outlived its own whispers, and May Callaway outlived the valley's fear. She didn't win, she endured, and in the end, that was the same thing.